Blood doesn't pool. It creeps. It slips into the tiny grout lines of the worn linoleum, spreading like a slow, dark river with a mind of its own. Chloe Bennett watched the crimson trail snake across the trauma bay floor until it finally reached the toes of her rubber clogs. Around her, first-year residents shouted over one another, their voices rising with panic, while monitors screamed and stretchers rattled across the polished floor. Everyone seemed hypnotized by the chaos. Chloe simply sighed. She tightened the knot of her blonde ponytail, reached for a sterile scalpel, and waited. The fluorescent lights inside St. Jude's emergency department never hummed. They buzzed with an uneven, insect-like vibration that burrowed into the base of her skull after 12-hour shifts. Most people stopped noticing it after a few weeks. She never did. Standing at the scrub sink in Trauma Bay 1, Chloe attacked the dried betadine beneath her fingernails with a stiff surgical brush. Ice-cold water rushed over her weathered hands. The water in this wing was always cold. She preferred it that way. Cold dulled the nausea. At 42 years old, Chloe felt decades older. Her lower back ached constantly, and every old injury complained whenever the weather changed. Her navy blue scrubs had faded from years of industrial washing, hanging loosely from shoulders that carried more fatigue than strength. Thin streaks of gray threaded through her blonde hair, pulled into a bun so tightly it stretched the corners of her eyes. She looked less like a newly hired clinician and more like someone who had simply never found the exit. "Make way for the trauma experts, Dr. Gentleman." The sarcastic voice belonged to Dr. Preston Cole, 28 years old, fresh out of an elite surgical residency. Perfect hair, perfect teeth, expensive peppermint mouthwash, and enough confidence to fill the entire emergency department. He leaned lazily against the glass partition, while another resident, Wyatt Sanders, stood beside him, wearing the familiar grin of someone who laughed whenever Preston did. Neither of them had noticed Chloe was ignoring them. She kept scrubbing. Pink soap slowly swirled down the drain. Preston finally pushed himself away from the glass and walked toward her. "I said excuse us, Dr. Bennett," he announced loudly. "Some of us actually have surgery to prepare for." Only then did Chloe shut off the faucet. Silence settled over the sink. She dried her cracked hands with a rough brown paper towel, her expression completely unreadable. On her first day, she'd introduced herself by her proper title. She held a Doctor of Nursing Practice degree and had been hired as St. Jude's new advanced trauma practitioner, a role designed to improve coordination between EMS crews and the trauma surgeons. To Preston, however, none of that mattered. An MD was authority. Everything else was support staff pretending to be important. For the past week, he had made certain everyone remembered that distinction. He called her Doc with mocking emphasis, handed her coffee orders, asked her to change bed linens, and treated her doctorate like an amusing clerical error. Chloe had never bothered correcting him. "Sink's all yours, Dr. Cole," she said quietly. Her voice roughened by years of cigarettes she had never quite managed to quit. She tossed the damp towel across the room. It landed perfectly inside the red biohazard bin. "Hey, Doc," Wyatt called after her with an awkward laugh. "Since you're heading out, grab me another box of size 7 gloves. Mine ripped." Chloe stopped walking. She slowly turned. Her eyes drifted toward Wyatt's hands. Soft, smooth, untouched by years of real emergencies. Hands that had known perfectly lit operating rooms instead of roadside ditches, helicopters, or collapsing buildings. "The supply room is 20 feet to your left," she replied evenly. "If you can memorize the Circle of Willis, I'm confident you can locate a box of latex gloves." Wyatt's smile vanished. Preston stepped closer until he towered over her. He intentionally invaded her personal space. "Careful, Bennett." His smile never reached his eyes. "You're here to assist. You're a nurse. A very educated nurse, maybe, but still a nurse. When real trauma comes through those doors, you hand us instruments, document what we say, and stay out of the way. Don't let the letters on your badge confuse you." For several seconds, Chloe didn't answer. Instead, her gaze settled on the pulse beating steadily beneath the skin of Preston's neck. She could almost see the carotid artery. Without warning, another memory surfaced. Blistering Iraqi heat, dust carried by scorching desert winds, blood pumping through a shredded neck wound, bare fingers clamping an artery because there had been nothing else available. No operating room, no attending surgeon, only survival. The memory disappeared as quickly as it had arrived. Bleach, disinfectant, burnt coffee, old blood. The familiar smells of St. Jude's rushed back. Noted, Chloe murmured, stepping calmly around him. The moment barely ended before the ambulance doors exploded open. Trauma incoming. Paramedics burst into the department, pushing a battered 30-year-old motorcyclist whose helmetless crash had left his face almost unrecognizable. The emergency department transformed instantly. Monitors beeped. Nurses scattered. Respiratory therapists moved into position. Preston immediately seized command. Airway first. Let's move. Wyatt hurried beside him, echoing every order. The patient thrashed violently against the straps. Blood poured from facial fractures. His jaw twisted into a grotesque angle that resembled shattered porcelain. Blood pressure 80/40, the nurse shouted. Pulses thready. 2 large-bore IVs. Preston barked. Get him on the monitor. Prepare blood. Move. Amid the controlled chaos, Chloe stood quietly beside the trauma whiteboard with a black marker in one hand, silently watching every movement, every mistake, and every second ticking away. Preston reached toward the patient's neck, searching for a carotid pulse. His fingers immediately slipped against blood, sweat, and grime coating the man's skin. He frowned, wiped his gloves against his gown, and tried again. Nothing felt certain. His eyes darted frantically around the trauma bay, searching for the source of the hemorrhage. The abdomen's rigid and distended. He said, Get to fast ultrasound. We need to know if he's bleeding into his belly. A nurse handed him the probe. Across the room, Chloe Bennett quietly uncapped the marker she used to update the trauma board. The sharp chemicals sent briefly filled the air. She barely noticed. Her attention wasn't on the patient's abdomen. It was fixed on his left leg. The femur was shattered, the broken bone stretching the denim until it looked ready to burst through. But the leg wasn't what worried her most. Her gaze dropped lower. A dark pool of venous blood continued spreading beneath the patient's pelvis, soaking through the stretcher pad far faster than anyone seemed to notice. Preston concentrated on the ultrasound monitor, pressing the probe harder against the swollen abdomen. Come on. The blurry image refused to cooperate. Wyatt struggled with an IV catheter beside him, his hands trembling enough to miss the vein twice. No one was looking where they needed to. Chloe already knew the answer. Massive pelvic fracture. The broken pelvic ring had likely shredded the fragile venous plexus hidden deep inside the pelvis. Blood wasn't filling the abdomen. It was disappearing into the retroperitoneal space, where leaders could collect before anyone realized the patient was dying. Everyone was staring at the spleen. No one was watching the pelvis. A familiar knot tightened inside Chloe's chest. She hated moments like this. Every experienced trauma clinician recognized them. The impossible choice. Stay silent and let pride delay treatment. Or speak up, bruise someone's ego, and become the target afterward. Neither option ever felt good. She absently rubbed her left shoulder. An old rotator cuff injury protested with a dull ache that always returned on damp days. The marker slipped from her fingers. It struck the floor with a sharp plastic clatter. At that exact moment, the wall radio crackled to life. Static hissed through the trauma bay before a strained paramedic's voice cut across the noise. St. Jude's, Medic 44. Initiating mass casualty protocol. 50-year-old male with severe blast trauma. Tourniquets applied in the field. Massive hemorrhage. Vital signs unstable. ETA 9 minutes. Every head turned. Even Preston looked away from the ultrasound. The motorcycle patient was finally stabilizing after the attending trauma surgeon had entered the room only moments earlier and immediately recognized the pelvic fracture Chloe had silently identified from the beginning. Preston had received a very public correction. His jaw remained clenched. Embarrassment lingered beneath his forced confidence. Explosive trauma? Wyatt asked quietly. Downtown shipyards. The radio answered through another burst of static. The attending physician didn't hesitate. gas explosion, or illegal lab. It doesn't matter, he barked. Clear Trauma Bay 2. Cole, you're leading this one. Bennett, activate the massive transfusion protocol. Move. The room exploded into motion. Nurses ran. Respiratory therapists prepared ventilators. Blood bank technicians answered emergency pages. Only Chloe refused to hurry. Running spread panic. Walking spread confidence. She crossed the room with long, steady strides, opened the blood storage cart, and lifted 2 heavy coolers filled with O-negative blood. The chilled bags pressed heavily against her palms. The familiar weight grounded her. She placed them beside the rapid infuser, connected each line with practiced efficiency, and carefully primed the tubing until every bubble disappeared. Every movement was deliberate, every step automatic. Years of trauma had transformed preparation into instinct. Then the emergency department doors burst inward. The incoming noise hit before the stretcher appeared. Shouted commands, metal wheels rattling over tile, boots pounding across the floor. Then came the smell. It slammed into Chloe like a physical blow. Burned plastic, cordite, scorched fabric, burning flesh. Her stomach tightened instantly. For heartbeat, she wasn't inside St. Jude's anymore. She was thousands of miles away beneath an unforgiving desert sun, breathing smoke while helicopters thundered overhead. The memory vanished as quickly as it came. For paramedics pushed the stretcher into Trauma Bay 2. The patient wore shredded tactical gear fused into blackened skin. Torn fabric had melted into raw muscle, while jagged pieces of metal protruded from multiple wounds. Federal agent, the lead paramedic shouted between breaths. Possibly military. We're not sure. Bomb detonated during a raid at the shipyards. He shielded the rest of his team from the blast. The man's skin had turned ghostly pale. His lips carried a frightening bluish-gray tint. Every breath came in uneven, painful gasps. On my count, Preston shouted, trying to seize command of the room. 1, 2, 3, transfer. The team lifted the large man onto the trauma bed. Fresh white sheets disappeared beneath, spreading crimson within seconds. Preston grabbed a pair of trauma shears and attacked the thick ballistic vest. The Kevlar resisted every cut. The blades jammed. He cursed under his breath and pulled harder. Damn it. Wyatt, help me get this vest off. Standing quietly near the head of the bed, Chloe finished threading a large catheter into the patient's uninjured jugular vein. Only then did she lower her eyes and truly look at his face. The man's face was weathered and deeply lined, as though years of hard living had been carved into his skin. A jagged scar split his left eyebrow, disappearing into blood-matted hair. His eyes were rolled back beneath half-closed lids, and incoherent words escaped his lips between ragged breaths. Chloe leaned closer. His injuries told a clearer story than his voice ever could. "Cole," she said sharply, cutting through the noise, filling the trauma bay. "He's got a sucking chest wound. Right lateral thorax. The ballistic vest is compressing the shrapnel." "I see it," Preston snapped. "I'm handling it." Frustration flashed across his face as he abandoned the trauma shears that had become tangled in the thick Kevlar. He grabbed the heavy vest with both hands and ripped open the Velcro straps. The vest peeled away with a violent tearing sound. The instant the pressure lifted, the room filled with a horrifying hiss. Air rushed into the chest cavity, through the open wound with every desperate breath. Then everyone saw it. A jagged piece of twisted metal, nearly the size of a clenched fist, protruded from between the patient's ribs. But that wasn't the worst part. Bright red blood erupted from beneath the shrapnel in rhythmic pulses. It didn't drip. It didn't ooze. It blasted outward in powerful sprays, striking Preston squarely across his chest before splattering against the clear face shield of his mask. For a split second, nobody moved. "Subclavian artery," Chloe said. The words landed like thunder. Preston froze. Completely. His gloved hands hovered uselessly above the wound while his eyes widened in disbelief. His breathing quickened. He had trained for trauma. He had practiced on cadavers. He had mastered controlled operating rooms. But nothing in residency resembled an explosive battlefield injury. This wasn't orderly anatomy. This was destruction. The cardiac monitor shrieked. Blood pressure plummeted. The patient's heart was rapidly running out of blood to circulate. Pressure, Chloe shouted. Preston remained frozen. His gaze stayed locked on the blood, soaking his scrub top. The world around Chloe seemed to narrow into a single decision. Hospital politics, professional hierarchy, titles, rules. Every one of them disappeared. Only the patient mattered. She moved. One powerful step carried her beside Preston. Her shoulders slammed into his chest, knocking him sideways. He stumbled backward into a tray of sterile instruments. Metal crashed across the floor in a deafening explosion. "What are you doing?" Preston yelled, barely catching himself before falling. "You've lost your mind." Chloe never answered. She didn't search for a clamp. She didn't ask for permission. She thrust her gloved hand directly into the torn cavity of the patient's chest. The warmth shocked her instantly. Blood surrounded her wrist like liquid fire. She reached deeper, pushing carefully around the twisted shrapnel embedded between the ribs. A sharp edge sliced through her latex glove. Pain flared across her palm as metal cut into her skin. She ignored it. Her fingers searched through slippery muscle until they found what experience recognized instantly. The torn subclavian artery. She pinched it between her fingers. Then she drove it firmly against the underside of the clavicle, using the bone itself to compress the vessel. She squeezed with every ounce of strength she possessed. Instantly, the arterial spray stopped. Silence settled over the trauma bay. Only the steady mechanical hum of the rapid infuser continued pumping blood into the patient's veins. Chloe remained perfectly still. Her arm disappeared into the man's chest almost to the wrist. Blood covered her glove, her sleeve, and tiny crimson droplets speckled her face. Her breathing stayed controlled despite the pain throbbing through her sliced palm. The patient's blood pressure slowly climbed. 70 over palpable. Then, 80 over 40. Preston finally pushed himself upright. His face burned crimson with humiliation and fury. "You assaulted me," he shouted, his voice shaking. "You're finished. I'll have your license revoked. I'll have security remove you. You don't lay your hands on a physician." Chloe never looked away from the monitor. She watched the vital signs continue climbing. Only then did she speak. "Wyatt." Her voice was calm, steady, almost frighteningly composed. "Get the attending trauma surgeon. Tell him I have manual control of a severed subclavian artery. He has only a few minutes before my hand gives out." Wyatt stared at her for half a heartbeat. Then he ran. The young resident nearly collided with the doors as he sprinted from the room. Only after he disappeared did Chloe turn toward Preston. The exhaustion that had weighed on her earlier was gone. Her eyes had become hard, focused, cold. "If you're here to help," she said evenly, "pack gauze around the wound without disturbing my hand." She paused. "If you're not going to help." Her stare never wavered. "Then get out of my trauma bay." Pain surged through her forearm. Her fingers had begun to cramp deep inside the patient's chest. Lactic acid burned through every muscle as her grip slowly weakened. She clenched harder. Failure wasn't an option. The cardiac monitor continued its steady rhythm. Each heartbeat reminded her that her hand had become the only barrier between life and death. She fixed her eyes on the glowing green numbers, refusing to move even a fraction of an inch. Then, from somewhere behind her, a commanding voice broke the silence. "Don't move, Bennett. Don't move, Bennett." The commanding voice belonged to Dr. Richard Gibson, the attending trauma surgeon. Broad-shouldered and weathered by 3 decades in emergency medicine, Gibson stormed into the trauma bay with remarkable calm. He always carried the faint scent of stale peppermint and freshly dry-cleaned wool, a combination every nurse in the department recognized instantly. He didn't waste precious seconds asking questions. One glance told him everything. Blood covered Preston's face shield. A tray of sterile instruments lay scattered across the floor. Chloe Bennett stood motionless, with her arm buried deep inside the patient's chest. The equation solved itself. "Vascular clamp," Gibson barked, extending his hand without taking his eyes off the wound. "Now." Wyatt nearly dropped the heavy instrument before slapping it into Gibson's waiting palm. His hand shook so violently that the steel rattled. Gibson positioned himself beside Chloe. His voice softened immediately. "I'm coming in beside your thumb." The sharp authority vanished, replaced by the steady tone of a surgeon who understood exactly what she was doing. "I know what you're holding." His eyes met hers. "And I know how little room we have for error." He carefully eased 2 fingers alongside her hand. "When I say release, back out half an inch." He paused. "Not all the way. I won't lock the clamp until I have complete control." "Understood." Chloe nodded once. Sweat trickled into her eyes, blurring the edges of the room. The smell of blood had become so overwhelming, she could almost taste copper with every breath. "I'm releasing," she whispered. Gibson slid the vascular clamp into the wound beside her fingers. Metal clicked softly against bone. Another inch. Another careful adjustment. "Then got it." The clamp snapped shut. "I've got the artery." "Pull back." Slowly, Chloe withdrew her hand from the patient's chest. The sudden absence of resistance sent painful spasms through her cramped fingers. She staggered backward. One boot slipped on fresh blood, covering the linoleum floor. She caught herself against the edge of the trauma bed before falling. Only then did she look at her hand. Her glove had been shredded. A deep, jagged cut stretched across her palm, where the twisted shrapnel had sliced through latex and flesh alike. Dark blood seeped steadily through the wound. She flexed her fingers. They still moved. Barely. No one noticed. The room had already shifted its attention toward Gibson. He was issuing rapid-fire orders. "Call cardiothoracic surgery. I need synthetic vascular grafts. Prepare the hybrid or keep the blood coming." The patient still had a chance. That was all anyone cared about now. Quietly, Chloe turned away. No one stopped her. No one thanked her. She pushed through the heavy double doors, leaving a bloody handprint on the stainless steel push plate. The corridor outside felt unnaturally silent. Bright white walls stretched endlessly beneath harsh fluorescent lights. The chaos behind her faded into muffled echoes. She walked toward the staff locker room. Every step felt heavier than the last. Inside, she crossed directly to the industrial sink. She twisted the faucet open. Scalding water rushed over her injured hand. Without hesitation, she peeled away the ruined glove. The latex clung stubbornly to torn skin. When it finally came free, pain exploded through her palm. She inhaled sharply. The wound was deep. Deep enough to require stitches. Maybe more. She reached for a bottle of iodine. Without pausing, she poured the antiseptic directly into the cut. Fire shot up her arm. Her jaw tightened as she gripped the porcelain sink with her uninjured hand until her knuckles turned white. Gradually, the pain settled into a dull, relentless throb. She raised her eyes toward the stained mirror above the sink. The woman staring back hardly looked 42. Dark circles shadowed exhausted eyes. Gray roots pushed stubbornly through faded blonde hair. Her shoulders sagged beneath bloodstained scrubs. She looked hollow, used up, like someone who had spent years giving away pieces of herself until almost nothing remained. "You're done, Bennett." The voice came from behind her. She didn't flinch. She watched the reflection instead. Hospital Administrator David Lawson stepped into the locker room wearing an impeccably tailored suit that probably cost more than 3 months of her salary. A leather portfolio rested beneath one arm. A digital tablet glowed in his hand. His expression balanced somewhere between corporate irritation and moral outrage. Standing just behind him was Preston. Fresh scrubs, clean face. Not a trace of blood remained. Only wounded pride. Lawson folded his hands. "You assaulted a surgical resident," he said coldly, "in front of 19 witnesses. You pushed Dr. Cole into a sterile instrument table and then performed an unauthorized vascular procedure completely outside your approved scope of practice." His voice remained perfectly measured. "You are a nurse practitioner, Ms. Bennett. You are not a trauma surgeon. You violated hospital protocol, exposed this institution to enormous liability, and ignored every chain of command we have." Chloe quietly shut off the faucet. She wrapped a clean paper towel tightly around her bleeding palm. Only then did she turn to face them. He froze David. Her voice remained calm, almost gentle. The subclavian artery was severed. He stopped moving. The patient had seconds before he bled to death. So I stopped the bleeding. You attacked me. Preston snapped, stepping forward. His confidence had returned now that the emergency was over. You shoved me aside because you wanted to play the hero. His face reddened. I had the situation under control. Chloe looked at him for a long moment. There was no anger left, no satisfaction, no bitterness, only a deep, weary pity for a man who still believed appearances mattered more than saving a life. You were hyperventilating, Cole. Chloe's voice remained calm despite the blood dripping through the paper towel wrapped around her injured hand. You weren't treating the patient. You were staring at the blood like you'd never seen an arterial bleed before. She held his gaze. You didn't even have a clamp in your hand. Preston's face flushed a deep crimson. Before he could answer, Administrator David Lawson raised one perfectly manicured hand. Enough. His tone was clipped and final. Dr. Cole's performance is a matter for the residency director. He shifted his attention to Chloe. Your conduct is a matter for human resources, risk management, and the hospital's legal department. He paused deliberately. Surrender your identification badge. Silence filled the locker room. You are suspended, effective immediately. His words landed one after another like stones. Pending termination, a formal complaint will also be submitted to the state nursing board. Clean out your locker. For several long seconds, Chloe said nothing. She glanced down at the blood, soaking her faded navy scrubs. Then her eyes settled on the inexpensive plastic identification badge clipped to her chest. A tired smile tugged at one corner of her mouth. It wasn't amusement. It was disbelief. She had survived 3 combat deployments. She had held dying soldiers together with field dressings, duct tape, and whatever equipment happened to be available while mortar rounds shook the walls around her. She had spent years making impossible decisions in impossible places. And now, her career was ending because a frightened 28-year-old resident couldn't admit he'd frozen. Slowly, Chloe reached toward the badge. Before her fingers touched it, thud, thud, thud. Heavy boots echoed through the hallway outside. Not the soft squeak of hospital shoes. Not security officers. Combat boots. Several pairs. The synchronized rhythm vibrated through the floor, cutting beneath the constant hum of hospital ventilation. Everyone in the room heard them. Lawson stopped speaking. Preston frowned toward the locker room entrance. The footsteps stopped. Then bang! The door slammed open so violently it struck the drywall, with a crack that echoed through the room. 2 men entered first. Neither wore police uniforms. Both were dressed in dark tactical clothing, without visible insignia. The faint smell of diesel fuel, cordite, and rain clung to their gear. They stepped aside. An older man followed. His Marine Corps Service Alpha uniform looked immaculate, despite the urgency of his arrival. 3 silver stars gleamed from his collar. His weathered face resembled carved granite, every line etched by decades of command. General Robert Hayes carried himself like someone who had spent an entire lifetime making decisions that determined who lived and who died. He didn't ask permission to enter. He simply walked inside. His cold blue eyes swept across the room. They passed over Lawson, ignored Preston completely, stopped only when they reached Chloe's blood-soaked hand. Lawson quickly straightened his expensive tie. "General," he began politely, "this is a restricted staff area. If you're here regarding the blast victim, someone can escort you too." "Shut your mouth." Hayes never raised his voice. He didn't need to. The quiet command carried more force than a shouted order. Lawson's lips snapped shut instantly. Color flooded his face. Without another glance in the administrator's direction, Hayes turned toward Preston. "You." His voice remained perfectly even. "Are you the attending surgeon?" Preston instinctively straightened his posture. His confidence seemed to return. "I'm Dr. Preston Cole, sir." He cleared his throat. "I was leading Trauma Bay 2 when your operative arrived." He forced a professional smile. "It was a difficult case, but we stabilized him." Hayes studied him for several silent seconds. "You stabilized him?" It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." Preston nodded eagerly. massive subclavian artery injury. It required immediate intervention to prevent exsanguination. He emphasized the technical language, hoping it would reinforce his authority. For the first time, Hayes moved. He reached into one of his uniform pockets and withdrew a heavy object wrapped loosely in gauze. Without warning, he tossed it onto the metal bench between the lockers. Clang! The object bounced once before coming to rest. It was a jagged fragment of artillery casing. Dark stains of dried blood still clung to the twisted steel. Hayes looked directly into Preston's eyes. My operative had this buried inside his chest. His voice remained almost conversational. When Dr. Gibson repaired the artery, he found deep compression bruising beneath the clavicle. He paused. He informed me that the only reason my man survived long enough to reach the operating room was because someone shoved a hand into the wound and compressed the severed artery against the bone. The room became absolutely silent. Hayes stepped closer. The smell of black coffee and brass polish drifted from his uniform. He stopped only inches from Preston. "Show me your hands, doctor." Preston swallowed. His Adam's apple bobbed visibly. "Sir, Hayes never blinked. "Show me your damn hands." Slowly, reluctantly, Preston lifted both hands into the air. Preston slowly raised his hands. They were spotless. No blood beneath his fingernails. No cuts across his palms. No bruises from forcing pressure into a shattered chest. Only clean surgical gloves wrapped around unmarked hands. General Robert Hayes studied them without speaking. The silence stretched for several painful seconds. Then he gave a quiet, disappointed scoff. Without another word, he turned his back on Preston. The dismissal stung far more than any lecture could have. Hayes walked across the locker room until he stood directly in front of Chloe Bennett. She didn't snap to attention. She didn't salute. Those days were behind her. She simply leaned against the sink, cradling her bandaged hand against her abdomen. Exhaustion etched into every line of her face. "General," she said softly. Hayes looked her over carefully. His eyes lingered on the faded scrubs, the streaks of gray in her tightly tied hair, and the blood seeping through the towel wrapped around her injured palm. "They told me a nurse stopped the bleeding," he said quietly. A faint smile touched his lips. "I should have known." Lawson finally found the courage to step forward. "General," he interrupted nervously, "there's been a misunderstanding." Hayes didn't acknowledge him. "Our hospital recently hired Ms. Bennett from the Veterans Affairs system as an advanced trauma practitioner," Lawson continued. "Unfortunately, she assaulted Dr. Cole and acted completely outside hospital protocol. We're in the process of terminating her employment." Only then did Hayes slowly turn toward the administrator. His expression never changed. "Terminating her?" The question hung in the air. "For what?" Lawson swallowed. "Rogue conduct." Hayes' eyes hardened. "Rogue conduct." His voice dropped so low that everyone instinctively leaned forward to hear him. "You mean saving a man's life while your resident stood frozen?" Lawson tried again. "She violated protocol." "No." Hayes shook his head once. "She violated his ego." The words landed like hammer blows. He turned back toward Chloe. For the first time, there was genuine warmth in his eyes. "You look tired, Captain." Preston blinked. "Captain." The title escaped his lips before he could stop himself. Hayes ignored him completely. "Fallujah." He spoke the name quietly. 2004. Helmand Province. 2009. Karbala. 2014. He smiled faintly. 3 combat deployments. Forward surgical team commander. He looked around the room. My Marines never referred to Chloe Bennett as a nurse. They called her a legend. No one spoke. The locker room became utterly still. "The reason several of my operators came home alive," Hayes continued, "is because she refused to leave them behind." He nodded toward Chloe's injured hand. "Some walk today with prosthetic limbs. Some carry scars that stretch from shoulder to hip. They're alive because she never quit on them." Silence answered him. Preston stared at Chloe as though seeing her for the first time. The woman he had mocked all week. The woman he had ordered to fetch coffee. The woman he believed belonged in the background had spent years treating catastrophic injuries under enemy fire while he was still studying anatomy from textbooks. Reality settled heavily over the room. Chloe released a long, tired breath. The adrenaline had finally disappeared. Only pain remained. Her shoulder throbbed with the familiar ache of an old injury. Her palm burned beneath its makeshift bandage. She managed the faintest smile. "I'm not a captain anymore, General." Her voice carried none of the dramatic confidence people expected from heroes. "I'm just a tired woman who needs 5 stitches." She paused. "And a cigarette." A genuine smile crossed Hayes' face. It lasted only a moment, but it softened years from his withered features. He stepped forward and rested a firm hand on her uninjured shoulder. "My operative is alive because of you." He gave a single nod. "You did good, Bennett." Then he turned toward Administrator Lawson. The warmth vanished instantly. "If this woman is fired," Hayes said evenly, "I will personally recommend that every Department of Defense Trauma Partnership, military training agreement, and federal grant with this hospital be reviewed immediately." The threat required no raised voice. Everyone understood exactly what it meant. She is not cleaning out her locker. His eyes never left Lawson. She is getting her hand stitched. And she deserves recognition for saving a life. Are we perfectly clear? Lawson had gone pale. His confidence disappeared. "Crystal clear, General." Hayes nodded once. He gave Chloe one final look of quiet respect before walking toward the door. His security detail fell in behind him without a word. The room fell silent once more. Chloe didn't celebrate. She didn't glance at Preston, who stood motionless with his eyes fixed on the floor, humiliation written across his face. Instead, she calmly unwrapped the blood-soaked towel from her injured hand. She opened her locker, removed a small suture kit, and headed for the door. There was still a wound to close, and patients were still waiting. The shift wasn't over yet.